this evening, always at our April board meeting, is our public hearing of the budget. This evening, we are presenting the Freehold Regional High School District fiscal year 25 budget. This year is a little different than in the past, as the Board of Education will not be voting on the budget tonight, as there's pending legislation that it wants to consider before finalizing this budget. While this legislation would not remedy our fiscal challenges, it will be important for the board to consider. And for that reason, this year, the budget vote will take place at our upcoming board meeting on May 14th. I think, before Mr. Boyce goes into kind of the nuts and bolts of the annual school budget report, I think it's important for us to hear and understand kind of the fiscal stage here at Freehold Regional High School District. Freehold Regional is $19.3 million below adequacy. That's the state's district-specific calculation of the amount of money that's necessary to provide a thorough and efficient education. So we need 19.3 more dollars in order to appropriately educate our students. That's the situation that we are here in at this district. Freehold Regional spending consistently ranks among 31 high school-only districts in the state, and it's lowest in the Monmouth County school districts. This is a fiscally responsible school district. We take pride in that, and we really feel that our budget is as tight as it possibly can be. This administration and the Board of Education have spent countless hours trying to manage the district fiscal crisis over the past 7 years. Years of S2 cuts have severely impacted us, and our future budget development strategies for fiscal 26 will be even more difficult and impactful unless state aid improves and the 2% tax levy is relaxed, or both. So balancing a budget at Freehold Regional High School District is no easy task. The uncertainty of our fiscal future is what concerns me most and was a major consideration in the development of this budget. We may now, after 7 years of clamoring through S2, see some governmental action to address the S2 disparity and be poised to provide a real means to raise needed funds to offset some of these catastrophic losses that Freehold Regional has experienced. The volatility of state funding and the timing of these proposals makes it difficult to develop multi-year projections and for this district to appropriately plan. At this present moment, uncertainty remains for fiscal year 25. This is the typical time where we present our budget and we vote on our budget, and that is not happening. Fiscal year 26 and beyond is a complete unknown as it pertains to where the district will stand with state aid, all while trying to recover from years of our S2 cuts. Please note, if the funding formula were to remain as is, Freehold Regional would be slated to see a $10.8 million state aid reduction in fiscal year 26. We do remain optimistic that things will change. But our challenge for fiscal year 25 was to close an $11.4 million deficit. And, I think it's important for folks to, know where did that number arrive at. We have the expiration of ARP ESSER grants. We have the loss of a one-time injection of supplemental stabilization aid of $6.7 million. That was a one-time. Our decline of our fund balance, an aggressive drawdown over these years of our surplus, and just the general rise in costs and inflation that I think each of us are all have complete understanding of. This budget, stands at 19.3 million below adequacy, and this is not sustainable. The budget that will be presented tonight reflects a continued aggressive drawdown of surplus, further increased budget risk through tightening of appropriations, thereby reducing the district's ability to manage unforeseeable costs. This budget has spreading equipment costs over multiple years, our Chromebooks, our technology equipment, our maintenance equipment, all being spread out through multiple years. The elimination of Raise Academy, tangible position reductions, which have been happening all through S2. Reduction of building-based instructional allocations, monies that go directly to the building principals and their teams, and transportation route consolidations. This budget reflects a reduction of 39 positions, including administrators, supervisors, teachers, and support staff. We always try to do our best to manage as much as we can through attrition. That's retirements and resignations. Unfortunately, this year, the budget was not able to absorb all the reductions through attrition. Since the inception of S2, our total staff has decreased by 135 positions. This budget was fully analyzed and tough decisions needed to be made, impacting many aspects of our educational landscape and impacting all levels of the organization. In working through this budget, our priorities remain focused on preserving our academic program and retaining as many instructional staff as possible. As we know, instruction and student supports are the heart of our work, and efforts must continue to create an administrative and supervisory environment that works alongside educators to maximize their effectiveness. Mr. Boyce and I have spent, and our team has spent a lot of time in reviewing and analyzing and preparing this budget. Mr. Boyce is going to kind of step us through the budget plan, and this reflects really a compounded impact of S2 and the difficult decisions that were made in order to balance this budget. Mr. Boyce, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Hazel. Certainly a lot to digest in those opening comments, and we'll touch on all of them as we work our way through. I think that the best way to approach this is to start sort of broad, right? What's the lay of the land? How is a school district budget structured? The state aid, the legislative component, how does that work into it? And then how did that impact Freehold Regional over time? Then we'll move to the FY25 budget itself, and finally, where do we go from here? So I wanted to start by just looking at an overall school budget. Now, this is the revenue side of the budget, and certainly there's a lot to look at there. What I wanted to first address is just the fund structure. So what you see here are three funds that represent, together represent the school district budget. For a total budget of 214 million. You can see that 207 million of that is in the general fund. So that's certainly the lion's share of it, and that's where we will be spending most of our time tonight. But let me just touch on the other two. I'll start from the bottom. The debt service fund reflects repayment of bonded debt. So a few years back, the community had a referendum, and that passed. And what that referendum actually does is it authorizes the district to issue debt and then perform the projects associated with that debt. So effectively, there's authorizing the community to levy, and between a combination of tax levy and state aid, to make those debt payments over time. So that's scheduled out for the duration of that bonded debt. And you can see it's going to be fairly consistent all the way through. Special Revenue Fund is for federal and state programs, and it's primarily federal, that are very specifically earmarked for specific use. Now, some of these are very routine and very steady. IDEA, a federal program, provides money for special education. The ESEA is the title grants, provides money, and they're fairly consistent. You'll see a sizable drop-off here, and what that represents is federal money that was in response to COVID. So COVID recovery money came in 3 pieces over time, and that money has expired, and so that's the reason for the fall off in revenue there. Now, that's actually contributes to the overall deficit that we worked to close, because some of those costs, although the intent was that they would match up with the need associated with COVID in the years that followed, and some of that need dissipated, but not all of it. So to the extent that it persists, then it moves up into the general fund and puts additional stress on the general fund. Other components of this federal funding, ESSER funding, this in particular is the ARP ESSER funding, are things that we were able to do during that time, but with the elimination of the expiration of the funding, those associated programs are no longer going to be continued. So general fund, and I want to spend some time on the two major categories here, which are property tax and state aid through the formula aid. These are both connected, and they both fall under the general umbrella of budget law that's imposed, and they work together. And so we're going to take a look at that specifically, just in general, and then we'll look at it as it applied to Freehold Regional over time. So the funding formula, state aid, SFRA, they're all essentially synonymous for the piece of legislation that enacts the school funding formula, and it's a methodology to ensure that all districts have an adequate amount of money to provide a thorough and efficient education. That's the charge of our state level legislators, is to come up with a system that ensures that happens, and that's a tall order, and there have been a number of funding formulas along the way. The one that is in place now, the School Funding Reform Act, came about in 2008, and I think the conceptual, the bones of it are very sound, they're solid, and it's a fairly straightforward approach, right? So first would be to measure how much should it cost, and then the second step of that is how are we going to pay for it? So that seems like a pretty reasonable approach to me. So here's how it works. They take the district-specific enrollment and push it through a uniform cost model to arrive at a number, the adequacy budget. Now that's a different number for every single school district, because although the cost model is uniform, which means it's the same cost model applied to every district has a different enrollment, has different demographics in their enrollment. And the cost model will address the specific characteristics of those students that have different needs, and therefore there are different costs associated with that. So that's the approach to determine what's necessary. The next step in this is to, the way that it's designed, it's local fair share first. So let's talk about that. That's the community. Think property taxes, the community's contribution to the adequacy budget to the extent that they are able to pay. And so the calculation of the local fair share has been volatile. And this is a tough thing to do, to measure a community's ability to pay, because that's going to take some judgment and some methodology that they have to land on. So what the formula calls for is to look at 2 wealth indicators, right, and then translate them into what could the community afford on property taxes. Those 2 wealth indicators are essentially the fair market value of your property, which would be an indicator of wealth, and also the income tax returns from the most recent year. So they take those 2 and convert them into a community's ability to pay. Whatever's remaining that's necessary to get to the adequacy budget, that would be what's called equalization aid, all right, or state aid. So state aid actually, there's really 2 categories. There's something called categorical aid, and those are different things that wealth does not influence the calculation of funding that would go to each school district. And very often they're things that just don't lend themselves to some broad-based formula or cost model. Things like transportation, because that's a geography that's impacted by geography. So a very rural area, their costs for transportation would be a lot more than an area that you could fill an elementary school in a 10-block radius, right? So they remove that kind of impact because it's not going to fit into a cost model that could be applied. So the categorical aids plus equalization aid, which is the only one that's influenced by wealth, together are what's known as state aid, and that's what appears on budgets in school districts across the state. So that's the design of it conceptually. How that's played out over time has been the subject of considerable debate. So what I have here is this is the local fair share and total state aid, because that's the more important number. It's not just equalization aid, and I'll speak more about that in a bit. But I'm going to give you a moment to just take a look at this. The red lines are what the SFRA calculated should happen, and the green lines are what actually happened. So take a moment to digest that. So the local fair share, let's talk about the red line of the local fair share. I mentioned earlier that it's somewhat volatile from year to year as in this measure of a community's ability to pay for its own education. And it's been, it's gone up significantly, but our property tax levy has not. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, is that there's another budget law unrelated to the SFRA that limits increases to the property tax levy by 2%. So the designers of the SFRA did not contemplate that limitation when they came up with a system to ensure that every district has an adequate amount of money to provide a thorough and efficient education. So in cases like Freehold Regional and other districts as well, the inability to access your local fair share has pushed us further and further below adequacy. Because on the aid side, the aid is calculated as if the entire local fair share is available to the district, which it's not because of the 2% cap law. So it's not surprising that as the local fair share red line goes up, the associated aid would go down, right? Because they're going to move in that relationship to each other, because taken together, they would need to fund adequacy. So the tax levy currently at $155 million for this 25 budget is $50 million below the state's calculation of this community's ability to pay property taxes, which is a significant differential. And it's not something that, if the 2% cap on the levy did not exist, I cannot imagine that over the span of the SFRA, that the district would have availed itself of that level of property taxes along the way. But that has been what the formula calculates. On the other side, it's also an interesting dynamic, because if you look at the green line of what actually happens, you'll notice that for several years there, the amount of aid remained flat. So there was a period of time where there was some philosophical differences at the state level as to whether or not the SFRA is the right approach. And during that time, the implementation of the formula was essentially paused, and districts got the same as they got last year. Now, some districts were on the good side of that, and some districts were not on the good side of that. So a district that had declining enrollment, if you think back to the circles of how much should it cost, as the student profile, the demographics dropped, then the adequacy budget would go down in a corresponding way. And therefore, because it's lower, after the local fair share, there would be less aid. There would be less money to pull together to meet adequacy. On the other hand, districts that had increasing enrollment, their adequacy budget was going up, their state aid was not going up, assuming local fair share remained consistent, their state aid was not going up. So there were a lot of districts that were under adequacy, districts with growing enrollment and other needs that wasn't being addressed during this time. Freehold Regional was on the good side of that. We had modest declines in enrollment, but more importantly, our enrollment wasn't going up. So the flat state funding over that stretch of years didn't harm this district. So at a point where S2, and you'll see S2, and that's a piece of legislation, refers to Senate Bill number 2, which was the state's attempt to step back and say, all right, we need to course correct here. And we need to start moving districts from this just flat, same as last year methodology to following the formula as it was designed. And in order to do that, they took a 7-year phase-in. To do it in 1 year would have been too abrupt for districts to be able to manage over time. And so during those 7 years, they gradually brought down the state aid of districts that were over-aided to where they should be according to the formula. Fiscal year 25 is the last year of that. Now, Freehold Regional is a district that is unique and is the only one that was impacted by a change in this trajectory of S2, and that happened last summer. So if you notice, the last 2 years of the green line on the aid side are flat. The reason for that is that legislation was passed that districts that met certain criteria, which we did, and I believe we were the only ones that did, would be exempt from S2 cuts in the final 2 years. So that's FY24 and FY25. And the condition to that was that courtesy busing would be provided during those years. So, and we had just cut courtesy busing in our original budget for the current year. So a year ago, right at this time, we had cut courtesy busing, and this piece of legislation that was championed by Senator Gopal, whose legislative district is within Freehold Regional, was able to pause those cuts for those 2 years. So that was extremely beneficial. The amount of the cuts, which was $6.7 million for 24 and another $4 million for the 25 budget, we've avoided. But effectively, what that legislation did was not eliminate those cuts, but simply defer them. So as of the 25 budget, looking towards the future, the state aid calculation has us slated to lose $10.8 million in state aid for the 26 budget, right? And that's those 2 years deferred. So good for now, but potentially a problem down the road. Now, I think with S2 coming to an end in FY25, there seems to be, and Dr. Hazel and I were down at the Assembly Ed Committee hearings and the Senate Ed Committee hearings to listen to some of that discussion. There seems to be some broad support for going in and taking a look at the SFRA ahead of the FY26 budget and making any adjustments that would make it work right. Again, districts like Freehold Regional and others that are significantly below adequacy have made the case along the way here during these years that, we need a path to adequacy. I mean, we in Freehold Regional, we started out in 20 with being 1.6 million below adequacy, and I'm going to cheat here. So at 21, we were 1.6 million below adequacy, then 4.8, then 11.4, 13.6, and now 19.3. So you can see it's a steady decline year over year. And some of the decisions that we've made along the way, we've made out of need, out of desire to keep programs and staff afloat, while at the same time advocating fiercely for reform in SFRA and a path to adequacy. So that's how the SFRA came about, and that's how it's impacted Freehold Regional over time. So, like as Dr. Hazel said, we are optimistic about the year ahead. I think now that S2 has come to a close, that's an opportunity to get in there. And since everybody is right, except for Freehold Regional, we're actually probably the only ones that are over-aided at this point to the tune of 10.8 because of the legislation that Senator Gopal championed and was very helpful and is again very helpful for fiscal year 25. So back to the revenue slide, there's a couple items on here, and this is really indicative of some of the challenges that this district and others face is non-recurring revenues getting matched up with recurring expenses, right? So and we've used those strategies, and they compromise the overall structural integrity of the budget. They will run their course. And predictably, as we knew, they were going to run their course. But things like this, these are one-time pieces of revenue, and I'm just going to use that as a jumping-off point. So the first is S3950. That's what I just talked about with the 2 years of deferred state aid cuts. So in 24, when we got the total was 6.7 million cut for 24. We were required to reinstate courtesy busing, which we did. That costs $3.5 million. And the balance of that, the $3.2 million that you'll see in the FY25, we did not infuse that into the budget and spend that. Instead, we held that back because we knew we would need it for 25. And we have it as an item of revenue in 25. And it's been helpful. I mean, even with that, still more than $11 million of a deficit that we needed to manage. The other item is, this was a one-time only infusion of state aid at this time last year. And it was the legislature's effort to sort of offset deeper than expected S2 cuts. But it was, it had its own category, and it didn't factor into the S2 calculations. But it was a one-time, and it's not available again this year. So districts, S2 districts, so districts receiving cuts, did get this one-time infusion of state aid, and that was very fortunate for that year. But we moved to the next year, and it's an immediate hole in our budget revenue-wise. So I just wanted to highlight those two things, and then talk more about other funding sources and other strategies that we've used along the way. You'll see the other important or significant item on here is fund balance. So as Dr. Hazel mentioned, we have aggressively been drawing down our surplus. Surplus fund balance are synonymous for the purpose of this conversation. And you can see there's, we're going from 16 million to 11 million. And that's going to be our continued trajectory. That's not a one-time thing. So as each year passes, as you would imagine, the more aggressive you are in your drawdown, the less that's available for future years. So on the revenue side, those are some unique aspects of it that I wanted to mention. I will also mention that something that Dr. Hazel noted in her opening comments was that we drew down an additional $2 million than had originally been set aside. That's included in the 11 million, but again, these strategies that we use to close a budget gap. So, okay, so the revenue story is up there. On the appropriation side, you all should have a handout that was available up at the table. And for those of you watching the video, it'll be in the budget section. There should be a copy of it there as well, and you should look at that in connection with this. So as you can see, better than 70% of the money that we spend goes towards instruction and support services. The next largest player at $25 million is transportation. Facilities, 9%, transportation 12%, facilities 9%, administrative costs 8%, and then there's some capital costs also included. It's actually not 0, but it's point less than 0.5, so it's coming up as 0. Let me just talk a little bit about facilities. So in typical times, a district would set aside money along the way into what are called facility reserves. There's 2 of them, but think of them as like savings accounts to accumulate money to pay for big ticket capital type projects, new roof, that type of thing. Things that are of a size that you can't fit into a normal operating budget. So there's an opportunity to set money aside, fill those reserves, and draw from them as needed. We have not been able to make any deposits into those reserves with our budgets over the last 5-6 years because we've needed the dollars to dedicate to the operating budget because of cuts in state aid along the way and being driven further and further below adequacy. So what a district will do, and what we've done, is a referendum to handle a collection of these big ticket items. We were able to do that a few years back for $15 million. It was roofing and paving projects, certainly not everything that needed to be addressed, but the most imminent priority 1 tier of roofing and paving projects. And the community was supportive of that. But in the meantime, we don't anticipate, we have not been able to deposit money in reserves. We don't anticipate to be able to budget to deposit money into reserves to handle that. So we need to incorporate that in our larger long-term thinking as far as our facilities and capital needs go. But at this time and for the foreseeable future, providing funding within an annual budget for that type of thing is just not viable. So let's talk specifically about closing what was initially an $11.4 million budget gap. And you take a moment to read the different categories that we have listed up there. Many of these things we've been doing along the way with S2. We've been engaged in this, and when you cut things like building allocations or curriculum resources and things like that, it's not likely to be in a position to be restored in the following year because we're still in cut mode with a new round of less revenue to work with. So if you compound this stuff over time, you really get to the point where there's not much left to do there. And as Dr. Hazel mentioned earlier, that our spending metrics are very low, to be the lowest among our 31 sibling districts. There's 31 high school only districts across the state. Our lowest spending among those. We're the lowest spending of the 50 or so Monmouth school districts, which we shouldn't be, right? Because high school students are more expensive than middle school students, and who are more expensive than elementary school students, and that's all reflected in that uniform cost model we talked about earlier. So with a district that's all high school students, you could make the argument you would expect that to be the highest spending district since they are all high school districts. So our spending metrics fare well, but that's an interesting thing to show, and I think it's the next slide. But it doesn't do any good on the ground because we're falling further and further below, and those metrics will continue to reflect lower and lower spending for the district, which is not something that we necessarily aspire to be, but it is an indicator of the efficiencies that we do have when you look at the opportunities available at Freehold Regional and at the price points. We think that's should really serve as a model for how to do it. Now, we do have economy of scale working in our favor, so that plays a role for sure. But a lot of that is in terms of, critical mass of student interest to support a program, whether it's culinary. If you have a 1,200 kid high school out there, there's not going to be enough kids interested in pursuing that path to begin a culinary program with a fully functioning restaurant and bakery and front of the house, back of the house. It's excellent experience over at Friel Borough High School that kids can apply for and get involved with. And it's because of our size and that there's enough students to support that type of program. I think Dr. Hazel has covered much of that in her opening comments and in addition along the way when we're talking about revenue items. So the work ahead of us is in anticipation of FY26. There are a number of things that we are going to look at and are in the process of looking at and exploring so that we are prepared to do the next level of things that we need to do in order to submit a balanced budget. In the area of transportation, courtesy busing would be back on the table, subscription busing, how does that look? We're going to look at changing school times and moving from a 2-tier transportation system to a 3-tier transportation system and see if that's something that's viable. In the area of athletics, that could include any one of or a combination of participation fees, fewer academic and extracurricular opportunities available, fewer levels of athletics, right? So there's a couple of different ways to go at that. And so that'll be part of our work as we prepare for the next year. Administrative structure, what are other ways to do that and leverage our administrative personnel to the best of our ability, and what are the financial implications of that? Other revenue, so sponsorships, advertising, that type of thing, perhaps accepting tuition students in certain programs is something that we're going to take a look at. That's nuanced as well, so we do have our work ahead of us for that. Selling assets included in tonight's in revenue tonight is the sale of 10 to 12 school buses because there's a bus driver shortage out there. I do not believe that is going to end anytime soon. And while we originally had 124 of our own drivers, we now have around 75 drivers because there's an extreme bus driver shortage out there. So I'm not going to maintain a fleet that's built for 100+ drivers. So those buses, some of those buses we're going to sell, and school buses have a useful life. So these buses would still have useful life ahead of them. But in selling assets, that's the type of thing we're looking for. There's also a parking lot adjacent to our transportation depot that we've cut. That's part of the appropriations cut, so because we'll have less buses, we won't need that lot. Other areas would, all of the areas I mentioned, and then finally programs themselves. And the undersubscribed programs, are we offering the right programs? The student interest shifted. Where can we make the best use of the dollars that we have in program offerings? So that would be refining our program. So a lot of work ahead of us in preparation for the decisions we may have to make come this time next year. So as I just mentioned, So here's the comparative, and this is available on the state's website. So if you go to the DOE section of the website, this is the Taxpayer's Guide to Education Spending, and what it does is it takes audited numbers and analyzes them, groups them with similar districts, so that you can have a comparative look at where you stack up compared to other school districts. You can see our spending per pupil of 14,512 is considerably less than the category right next to it, the grade category, which is all 31 of the high school only districts. So we're the lowest of that grouping there. And then you can see where, other groupings of districts based on grade range and enrollment and how that shakes out. So all that information is available district by district, category by category. It's a good resource to see really where your district stacks up on spending. So property tax impact for what was advertised in the tentative budget is of a 2% increase in the levy. It looks like this. Now, a couple comments about this. This is tax rate, right? There is more than the tax rate that factors into the amount of property taxes you pay as an individual property owner. Monmouth County had piloted a program to bring all municipalities, their assessed value, which is the actual basis you pay your taxes on, up to fair market value in an effort to just make the tax burden spread evenly across, not only from town to town, but within each town. So that as those assessments and the value of the properties go up on the tax assessor's books, then necessarily the rates come down. So this is not the whole story. What I would suggest is that you get your individual property tax bill, and any questions that you have, your local assessor can address those specifically. But from a tax rate perspective, this is what it looks like with a 2% increase on the budget. Now, this is something that is currently in motion. It's pending legislation because there are a number of districts, and just generally speaking, there are some school districts that are a year or two ahead of us in being in a crisis position, and those districts are confronting that now. One of the legislature's responses to that has been this proposed legislation that would allow districts to increase property taxes. And for those districts who were cut this year, a portion of that, they would be eligible to receive a grant, which would just be more state aid. But that's only for the current year and only for 2/3 of the current year. We have no current year cuts. So for districts like us, it's a 5-year look back. So the way it works as currently proposed, but not yet passed, is you look at what your state aid is for 25 compared to what your state aid is for 21. That difference, you would be allowed to go beyond the 2% cap. That differential for us is $10 million plus. So there was a lot of discussion about that among the administrative team, Dr. Hazel and our team, as to what the different variations of that look like. What I've included here is it's not the full 10 million. It's 7 million to get to the 10 million. That's actually the spread there, but inclusive of the 2% rather than in addition to, as something to put forward for the board's consideration should this be available by the time we adopt our budget on May 14th. So the corresponding tax impact, so instead of the one that we just looked at, it would look more like that. Now, that is something that passed the Assembly last week. It's scheduled to be heard or considered by the Senate in the weeks to come, September 9th. And then the last day for a school district to adopt a budget is May 14th. We've moved our May meeting to May 14th. It was earlier than that, just to preserve options for the board to the greatest extent that we can. So that's something that is not yet resolved. We'll see where we land when it comes May 14th, and the board will consider course of action from there. If this were to be the course of action, this is our view of how that additional $7 million would be spent. A lot of the things that we discussed here that we've discussed previously in this presentation, so they'll be familiar to you. A couple things I do want to point out. Reinstate the Raise Academy. So the Raise Academy is a twilight program that was discontinued, but with the federal COVID-related grant money, when that did come, that was one of an important response to COVID and discipline issues and getting students readjusted. Raise was a very useful tool and was funded through that program. But with the ESSER money expiring, that federal grant money expiring, Raise was not included, is not included in the budget. That includes a 2% increase on the levy. It's not technically a cut because it was never funded through the general fund, but nonetheless, Raise would not be here next year. One of the things that we would propose to do is to bring Raise back for another year and continue that resource for our students for one more year. Budget risk, let me just address that in general. So one of the collection of strategies that we've used along the way during the S2 years was to tighten appropriations without a corresponding cut. Now, obviously risk comes with that. If you reduce your utility appropriation, you're more aggressive with your projections, well, there's more risk that you may not have sufficient funds in that particular line item. I mean, we have not, well, although we've become more risk tolerant in those areas, we've not crossed over into irresponsible, in my opinion, but that's where we're headed. We're approaching it, and in some cases, we're fairly close to it, more than I'm really comfortable with, but those are the things that we need to do in order to keep programs and services available to our school community. So a part of the risk, the additional risk taken on in this 25 budget, we would restore some of that, and it's roughly 50% of the risk taken. You see the area of adjust appropriations, and what that refers to is in the area of health benefits. One of the things that we did along the way in S2 years was move to a fully insured health benefits program. There is more risk in that, but there's also more opportunity to reap the benefit of a low claims year. So that's the one area that we would be, one of the areas that we would be looking at in there. So with this pending legislation, should it become available, the tax impact was the previous slide, but it's another $7 million plus of revenue, and this is how that would be deployed. This is how we're proposing that be deployed. I'm sorry, I'm holding this upside down, so I'm going backwards instead of forwards. So that's an overview of the FY25 budget, and so I think the important takeaways here are, a lot of the strategies we've used have run their course. We have a potential problem waiting for us in 26 in terms of state aid. We are hopeful that the state spends some time with the SFRA and makes the necessary adjustments so that districts have an opportunity to get to adequacy budget and have an adequate amount of money to provide a thorough and efficient education by that measure. And we're also hopeful that the legislation that's currently pending is seen as passed, and that the board can consider the options associated with that. So with that, Dr. Hazel, I'll turn it back over to you, and then questions from the board and questions from the community.
Mr. Boyce, thank you. As always, an extremely clear presentation. I think really demonstrates, our current situation for the fiscal year 25 budget and, potentially where we're heading in the future. Our goal as a district is to move in getting our budget, to at least adequacy. We hope these bills, it's really a stepping stone. I don't, see that they are the answer to, all of our concerns here at Freehold Regional High School District, but we'll, take each step, as they come. We are hopeful that the legislators will be, reviewing and making changes to the SFRA. That's the school funding formula to ensure, that districts, like ours can get to adequacy. We will, as superintendent, business administrator, and our central office team, our building administrators, we are going to continue to work to prepare for a range of future scenarios. I can't wait on that work. We will be back here, in April. So preparations begin once we get through this to begin to kind of look at our district and plan for our future. We remain steadfast in advocating, for reasonable, funding reform. And I know everybody that's here, our Board of Education, our administrators, all of our, professional staff, we all remain committed to advocating, for our children's education in this school district. That's our top priority. I would like to thank Manalapan Township for being here this evening, Marianne Music and Susan Cohen. They're always out gaining the knowledge and supporting, this school district. So thank you very much. Also tonight here with us is Michael Iliano from Senator Gopal's office. If you can give a wave, we have spoken by phone, has been extremely helpful in kind of assisting us and navigating this work. I believe from his office and Senator Gopal's office, we're very hopeful for this legislation, but really hoping for further change in the future. The Senator's office is, been kind of our partner, hand in hand, always, willing to pick up the phone, talk with us, listen, spent time at those Senate Ed Committee meetings down in Trenton. We will remain, on a path of advocacy, for the students of this school district. So just very hopeful that everything goes well on May 9th, and that gets signed by the Senate. Still, I think, needs a governor's signature. We have extended, as Mr. Boyce mentioned, May 9th board meeting will now be May 14th. That is the absolute last day. So if everything is in check, we could possibly look at, that Plan B option for our budget, which would be extremely, helpful.
Good?
Yes, yeah,
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Board, so questions from the
Yeah,
board? Any
so
questions from the-
I have a comment. We used the word hopeful after hearing the beginning of his presentation. So many of us have been here for so long as board members and principals and assistant principals and teachers. We've been beat up and we rose. Every year we seem to, and when you talk about 26, I don't have any hair to lose, but it's frightening. So we just have to hope that there's a better scenario out there. The busing last year was a great blessing. When you see 39 staff members reduction, that's hard. And when you look at 135 over 8 years, that's a lot. So, and I've walked through the buildings, our class sizes, they're big. So, and that's happens when you cut. So, but you use the word hopeful. I think all of us are. And hopefully May 9th we'll be walking out with a little bit of a smile. Any other board members' comments?
I have a question.
Mr. Messenger?
Sure. Mr. Boyd, on the last slide you had, when it had the potential tax increase that may come,
Yes.
so if it said Marlboro 1.8, does that mean 1.8 cents higher?
Percentage?
Give me a moment,
Was it
Mr.
green?
Yeah, the tax rate would go up. It's a 3.7% increase in the tax rate and that increase is 1.8 cents.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Boyce, if I may? So the piece of legislation that is currently before government allows potentially for an increase of 6.67%, but we, in that Plan B model, would only be requesting or only be upping our tax rate 4.67%, right?
So-
So we're 2% under what the state would allow under that model.
That's correct, but just some clarification, because coincidentally, some of the numbers match up. That's an additional on top of the 2%.
So it
So,
would be 8.7.
right, the 8.7, that would be inclusive, I'm sorry, of the 2%. The
Okay.
6.7 is for the $7 million. That's also inclusive of the 2%. So
Okay.
an additional
You're right,
4.7 or 6.7, but 4.7 is what was,
But
an
this-
additional 4.7 is what was represented on the board.
But the law would state that we could get, if it passes,
Eight-
would state we could take up to 8.7, and we're, as
That-
this Frill Regional is not requesting that amount, correct? No.
That's correct. And so interestingly, there is in the law a cap of, that you can't go over overall 9.9%. So but for us, even if we accessed, all of that was available to us, that would only bring us to 8.67, so that overall cap we don't get to that. Yes, but your summary is right. We're not looking to add an additional 10 million, it's an additional 7 million, which results into an overall tax increase of 6.67%.
Thank you.
Any other board member comments? All right, Mark Parisi?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bruno. I just want to thank all the administration that are here tonight, and for the last few years, you guys have really done more with less into our administration, and I understand that because I work in state government, and sometimes we get cut, and they tell you to do more with less, and I just appreciate that. I was on the Finance Committee this year, and we've kicked around everything that's happening right now, and I just want everybody to know that one of the things that we did talk about recently, and I think it's important that the community understands, is that if we do end up going out and raising taxes, we don't do it lightly, and it's important for me, I'll speak for myself, that our community understands that if we access this money, I will do everything to advocate that this money is appropriated towards the student experience. I communicated that to Dr. Hazel and the administration, to our facilities, that this money is going to be spent in areas to enhance the student experience, student support programs, and I just want the community to know that that's important to me. Thank you.
Thank you.